We're very excited to have Dr. Robert Gegear here with us tonight. He's a professor of biology at UMASS Dartmouth, and he's been studying neuroecology for over 25 years, which is pretty exciting. Just recently, he was featured at EcoRI, which is the newsletter out of Rhode Island, and the entire article seemed to have been all about him and his research. So besides all of his projects that he does professionally, Dr. Gegear is also the founder of an organization called the Beecology Project, and he's going to talk to us about that as well. And that is a citizen science effort, which you all could volunteer for. So he'll tell you more about that. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let Dr. Gegear take it from here. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about some of the work that I'm doing on the conservation of plant pollinator or pollination systems. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term pollinator, have used it, may have pollinator gardens and habitats, and I think often after I give talks I hear that people haven't seen discussions of pollinators in this way. And you'll notice in the talk I have more than just a buzz, and for the most part I give a lot of in-person talks or workshops, and I start off by saying, okay, tell me what the definition of a pollinator is, and without fail the definition is incorrect. And I think that understanding what a pollinator actually is, bringing the pollen back into pollinator, the term pollination system, I think really helps to bring out the proper definition. Changing our view slightly on how we approach conservation of these systems and their importance, understanding what their importance has really accelerated conservation efforts in Massachusetts and expanding out into New England. So more than just the buzz means that it's not just about the bees. People think pollinator bees and typically honeybees, but it actually has very little to do with the bee. It has everything to do with their functional role as pollinators, and there's a huge difference between those two, and that gets at that definition of pollinator. So I'm going to start today's talk with some background. I call it Pollination Biology 101, so we understand the system. I'm then going to talk about why the system's in trouble and what we need to do to try to help the system. And then I'm going to finish the talk by discussing some of the projects that I've started over the past few years, and also hopefully recruiting you to that Beecology Citizen Science Project that was mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my talk. So what is the difference? What exactly is a pollinator? So a wide variety of animals visit flowers to feed on the nectar or pollen or both. Globally, there are about 200,000 of these species, the vast majority of which are insects. So of the 200,000, only about 1,000 are vertebrates, like the hummingbird shown here. These animals have a wide variety of options when it comes to floral resources. So if you look at the background, you can see that this is a field that has several plant species in bloom, and these animals have to figure out which ones have the best rewards, and they're competing with one another, and there's a lot going on from the animal side. So these animals visiting flowers, if they're visiting for nectar, they're a nectarivore. If they're visiting for pollen, they're a pollinivore. If in the process of collecting food, they transfer pollen, leading to fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit, then and only then can we change their name from a flower visitor to a pollinator. So the term pollinator itself is a plant-based term. It has really nothing to do with the animal. It has to do with the transfer of pollen, and it has to do with plant reproduction. And so of the plant species shown in the back, each of these plant species is trying to target a subset of the animals shown on the screen. Each one's going to target a different subset. And so the subset of animals that they're targeting are these pollinators. And the reason that the fertilization and production of seeds and fruit in that definition of pollinator is so important, it's because there are many cases where you could see an animal visiting a flower, transferring pollen, where it doesn't lead to the production of seeds and fruit. So, plant reproduction, we've got the stamens producing pollen, landing on the stigma, we get production of the pollen tube, fertilization, and we get the production of seeds and fruit. If we look at our an example over here, if we had an animal on a plant that is what's called self-incompatible, that means it can't get fertilized by its own pollen. We may see a bee or a butterfly moving up this plant, collecting nectar, transferring pollen, but it doesn't lead to fertilization. There's no reproduction going on. Similarly, we could see our animal visiting this plant species and then moving to another plant species. Again, we're seeing pollen being transferred from the species to the meadowsweet. But there's no fertilization. And so, in fact, there's a cost from the plant's perspective because the pollen donor's perspective, it's wasting gametes. And from the recipient plant's perspective, the foreign pollen blocks the surface of the stigma and prevents it from receiving its own pollen. So plants have a variety of mechanisms that they use to get their pollen to move to preferably another individual of the same species. Now, there certainly are some plants that are self-compatible, but those plants produce fewer seeds and fruit, lower quality fruit, than they do if they're outcrossed. So plants really want to, for the most part, want their pollen to move out, to be outcrossed. So pollination, then, the definition has to include the fertilization, production of seeds and fruit. We're going to see why this is absolutely critical to understand how pollinators are linked to biodiversity. Any animal that helps to complete this process then can be considered a pollinator. Now, let's look at the pollination system. Then if we look at the plant and all of the animals that pollinates it, then that's called a pollination system. To emphasize the difference between a pollinator and a flower visitor in our system here, here's the obedient plant. We've got two bumblebees, Bombus fervidus shown here and Bombus affinis shown here. Bombus fervidus is going into the flower to collect the nectar, and in the process is transferring pollen, leading to fertilization, the production of seeds and fruit. Our Bombus fervidus is a pollinator. A Bombus affinis, on the other hand, is going to the outside of the flower, right, not making contact with reproductive parts, and biting a hole at the base of the flower and robbing the nectar. Our Bombus affinis is a flower visitor. In fact, we could also call our Bombus affinis a parasite because it's receiving a benefit. It's getting the nectar without giving anything back in return to the plant. And also, it's costly to the plant because when our Bombus affinis takes the nectar, our Bombus fervidus comes in and realizes that there's no nectar and will move to another plant species. And so our plant won't get pollinated. It actually is going to deter our pollinators. So we could have thousands of Bombus affinis on our obedient plant, and we would never, it's not appropriate to use the term pollinator because there's no pollination going on. We can't hope that our animal is going to pollinate something in the future. We have to make sure that the plant that it does pollinate is there at the same time, and then we can call it a pollinator. Similarly, if I could replace my obedient plant with a feeder, and I could have thousands of our Bombus fervidus, we still don't have any pollinators, right? We're feeding the animal, but we are not enabling it to perform its ecological function, and that is plant reproduction. So allowing the plant to reproduce. And this is a very important distinction. When we look out into the wild, we see that these systems are very complex. So if we were to look at our pineland golden trumpet, we go out, we see a lot of things buzzing around and flying around, some butterflies and bees. All the bees and butterflies we observe collecting nectar are shown here. The ones that are actually doing the pollinating are circled in green. So if we remove these three species, we may see a lot of diversity on our pineland golden trumpet, but none of them are pollinators. They're all flower visitors. The plant is not benefiting at all, and things that use that plant, use the products of pollination for food, shelter, and nest sites are also not receiving any benefit. Similarly, I could get rid of all these species, and I certainly would lose some diversity, but the plant would still maintain its function, right? It'd still reproduce, and the plant would be able to persist. So these pollination systems come in a variety of forms. I mentioned earlier on that each plant species is targeting a subset of those flower visiting animals. Some are targeting small bees, some are targeting large-bodied bees, some are targeting short-tongued bees, some are targeting long-tongued animals. So it could be long-tongued bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds could be a system. So this is just, this is showing you some examples of systems. So these systems can be generalized. Again, long-tongued bees, some may specialize on hummingbirds. So this one's hummingbird pollinated. Notice the pollen is deposited on the forehead of the bird. which maximizes pollen transfer efficiency from the plant. If it deposited on the wings of the hummingbird, it would be a very effective way to transfer pollen. Some are highly specialized. So here we've got a fly pollinated plant species that it's basically you remove the fly, the plant dies, and if we remove the plant, the fly dies, and the fly it goes extinct. So talking at the population level. And so this fly, the tube of this flower goes down off the slide, and this fly has a tongue that matches the tube length, the nectar located at the bottom of the tube. And in our butterfly pollination system, we see the pollen located, it deposits on the tongue of the butterfly, and it's poking around looking for nectar and transferring pollen as it does so. So these pollination systems then, right? And so we've defined them as a plant species and all the animals that pollinate it. We can think of pollination systems in an artificial. We can separate artificial and natural. So the artificial systems are those that we see in agriculture. Right? We've genetically engineered or selected for plants that have certain traits. They're going to produce certain food. We have certain quality of the fruit and seed that's produced from these plants, and they're pollinated by a subset of species. Some of them are non-native, like the honeybees play an important role in these artificial systems. And so we're forming the connection between the plant and the animal. There are a subset of native species, bees, that are also used in this context. But when we look at all the species that I talked about, the 200,000 species in North America, there are between 3,000 and 4,000 bee species. Only about 5% of them actually visit crop plants. So these systems are highly specialized. We've created them that way. And so the products of pollination in these systems are benefiting one species primarily, and that species is us, and clearly we're very important. But that's very different than looking at pollination systems in an ecological context. So our native pollination systems, where the animal and the plants have co-evolved to benefit from one another. There's a reciprocal relationship. And so the problem that I see is that people use the term pollinator and immediately they're just thinking of the animal. I see a lot of animals feeding on the flowers. We've got to put up hummingbird feeders because we want to save the hummingbirds, and they're forgetting about the pollination. You need the plant in the system. You can think of the animal and the plant as one. And the reason that it's important to not just think about that plant, but also the diversity of those systems is because they form the foundation of ecosystems. They generate biodiversity. So the different plant species pollinated by different animal species, different animals are feeding on the seeds of those different plants. So we may have some of our small mammals feeding on our hummingbird pollinated plant species. We may have some birds feeding on the seeds of our long-tongued bee pollinated systems. And so the diversity of these systems is supporting diversity. Of course, we also have predatory species that are feeding on these species as well. So everything is connected. And as we start to erode pieces of our foundation, we are going to start to see effects that cascade through our system. And that's why we can think of these systems as building blocks. We have a diversity of systems, we're building biodiversity. And when I start to talk about what's in decline, we're going to notice that some of these systems are in decline and some of them aren't. And so we really need to think about, what are we introducing into the environment? Are we putting things back together? Or are we just amplifying things that don't really need to be amplified? And so if we look at, so that's, biodiversity is important, ecosystem health. From an agricultural perspective, pollination has a clear dollar value, right? Crop production, agroeconomy, billions and billions of dollars a year in North America alone per year. And so people may, and I hear this a lot, well, who cares about biodiversity? Who cares if we lose a few species here and there? I don't really notice anything different. So what does it matter? Well, it matters a lot when you think about what are called ecosystem services. These are things we get from nature for free. Carbon sequestration, soil decomposition, recreation, all of these we get through healthy, diverse ecosystems. And there's a significant price tag associated with them, especially if we lose them. So as we start to lose these services, we either have to replace them if we can do so, which has a significant price tag. And in many cases, we won't be able to replicate what nature is doing for us. And then we're going to be in really big trouble. So the problem is that losing diversity is a slow burn, and people aren't thinking 10 years down the road, and we're going to get massive loss of biodiversity, and this ecosystem collapse is going to happen very rapidly, and we're not going to be able to put it back together because, as they say, extinction is forever. So what I'm trying to do is to bring this to people's attention and get people to start to restore and protect these vulnerable parts of the system so that we don't lose these services and the diversity that generates them. So to give you a quick example of what I mean by pollination systems as building blocks, let's look at Monarda, hummingbird pollinated plant species. Here's our hummingbird pollinator and the result of the pollination products. So in terms of the seeds produced, we've got our purple finch that's going to be feeding on the seeds produced. The more pollination we get, the more seeds, the happier our purple finch is. We've got our orange mint moth, which is uses Monarda as a host plant. Those adults are going to feed our eastern whippoorwills, right? Feeding on moths at night. And we can also look at the larva. The larval stage is really great source of protein for birds. And so we've got not just the purple finch, but we've got other birds species that would be feeding on our orange mint moth larva. So we're just through this pollination and this system, we're supporting all of this biodiversity. Now, let's look at what I mean by just feeding the animals. Here we have a hummingbird feeder. We have tons of hummingbirds, right? Hummingbirds are happy. Here we're saving one species, right? Assuming that our hummingbirds are in trouble, they're going to be very happy. But here we're saving many species, and we're saving the functional role of that animal in the ecosystem. In addition, if we had Monarda and we had our hummingbird feeders, birds aren't stupid. They're going to move over and stop visiting our Monarda, and they're going to start feeding off from the hummingbird feeder. One-stop shopping, feed up, go back to their nest, take care of the young. And so here we've got very healthy and happy hummingbirds, but we've got a lot of unhappy, and we're not supporting biodiversity because we don't have the seeds produced through the pollination, assuming that this Monarda was self-incompatible. We could also replace our feeder with a non-native species. We may get pollination. These birds may pollinate European honeysuckle. The problem is our native birds don't want to eat the seeds. Our native butterflies and moths do not want to use non-native species as a host plant. And this makes perfect sense because these systems are co-evolved. They've co-evolved to the chemistry and everything about those plants. That's why it's important that we think of them as one thing, the plant and the animal together, and then other species that are using that plant. So we could think of our native plants as hubs for all of this biodiversity. And when we put in a non-native plant, we're using up space that could be used by natives. They may be stealing the pollinators, reducing the amount of seeds and plant material available to these species. And there are a lot of negative effects that they could have. So we're focused on keeping the plant pollinators, native plant pollinator systems. That's our target. The problem is that many of these systems are headed in the direction of local extinction. The systems are being degraded through the decline and loss of species. This isn't just a Massachusetts or New England problem. This is a global problem. Here's some data for bumblebees that I collected, historical versus current. You can see that, where the yellow bars are lower than the blue bars, we're seeing decline. It's the same with butterflies. It's the same with non-bombus bees. So all our solitary nest, a lot of the solitary bees we have, which number in the hundreds, and not surprisingly, we're seeing the same thing in plants. And the plants that are declining are pollinated by the animal species that are declining. As I said, we need to start thinking of this as these animals and plants as one. Now, what I want to point out here, and this is a surprise to many, while some species some have become locally extinct and some are headed in that direction from both the plant and the animal side, there are many species that are stable or increasing in abundance and spreading in terms of their distribution. They're expanding their ranges. So here we've got two bumblebees, Bombus impatiens in particular, was fairly abundant in August, but now I go into areas that have been with high levels of human disturbance, and I'm seeing thousands of them just that species where I should be seeing 4 or 5 other species. The same with butterflies, many species increasing, and it's the same with plants. So when we think about conservation and we think about these systems, we really have to think at the species level. We can't just say bees are in decline or bumblebees are in trouble, because that's not true. It's not true of butterflies. There are some species that are in trouble. And the problem is that everybody treats them as the same thing, this one size fits all approach. And that is actually accelerating the loss of these species from these systems. And we need to, again, we need to change our view of pollinator, what it is, and we also need to think more at the species level. The other thing we need to do is really understand what is meant by a specialist species versus a rare species versus a declining species. So here, I've heard this about specialist bees. We need to plant for specialist bees. Well, if our specialist bee is a specialist on goldenrod, goldenrod isn't declining in the state. Goldenrod is everywhere. So in terms of the risk or the how much of conservation concern the specialist is, it depends on the plant that it's specializing on. There are other species like Bombus sandersoni that historically was rare and it's currently rare. So it's been stable and rare. So we're not having a negative effect. And then we have some bees like this Bombus terricola that were historically abundant on the Cape in the 80s. And then into the early 2000s, this bee couldn't be found anywhere except for Western Mass above 1,000 feet. And that's where it is in small populations. So it rapidly declined, and it's only found in a few locations at the state. And so what we need to do is start to focus on these declining species. Historically abundant, they're now rare. And that's not just from the animal side, that's also from the plant side. So what do we need to do to fix the problem? Well, we need to understand what we're doing to cause the problem. And in terms of these systems, there are a lot of things that have been proposed, and my lab studies all of these things, and I could talk for hours about each one of them. I'm going to focus on the bottom two, but pesticides are not good, especially the neonicotinoids. It's very clear that they might not outright kill the animal, the bee or the insect, directly, but what happens is that they get chronic exposure. It changes their behavior. They're less able to collect nectar, and it's one of these slow burn declines. Disease, either new diseases into the system, or we're seeing that there are diseases coming from non-native species, the honeybee being the main one. There are a lot of diseases moving from honeybees to native bees. This is a problem. Climate change puts the plants and the animals out of sync. We have a warm spring, things are in bloom. The animals aren't, that they go out of bloom when the animals emerge, and that's the problem there. Today, what I'm going to focus on, I think the major driver here is habitat change and habitat loss, and the introduction of exotic species. These other things, pesticides and disease, spillover from honeybees, are a problem in urban areas and agricultural areas, but we're seeing declines in areas where there are no pesticides. Right. And so that tells us that there's something else going on. And so what we see is that there's a major driver of decline, and there are multiple factors contributing. The pesticides and the disease are accelerating the declines that were already happening because of some of these other factors. So as I mentioned, we have species that are increasing or stable species, and we have these declining species. And I said we need to focus more at the species level. And so the next question then is, in terms of the habitat, what exactly do these species need? It isn't, they need flowers. Well, that's true. If they're feeding on nectar and pollen, they need sources. But what exactly do they like to eat? And, and again, it's shifting from bumblebee plants and butterfly plants to Bombus fervidus. What exactly does it need to complete its life cycle? And it's going to depend on what the target species is. In butterflies, they need a host plant and they need a nectar plant. So you could have the most beautiful garden that's blooming all through the season, but if you don't have the host plant, you're not going to see that butterfly. Both of these are needed for it to complete its cycle. In bees, they need a place to overwinter. They need a place to nest. They need food to get their cycle completed. To put out enough reproductives that they can mate and then go into the overwintering period to keep that population persisting. In plants, who are the major pollinators of these plants that are in decline? And are they also in decline, or exactly what is the relationship between the plant and its pollinators. And we know surprisingly little about these interactions. We know a lot about where butterflies are and where bees are. It's all taxonomy. We know very little about the ecology, especially at the species level. And this is where the problem is, that people think they know about bumblebees, or they think they know about bees, and they say, okay, well, I've seen bumblebees on this plant, so let's put that plant in. And as we'll see in a second, that's not good enough, because the bees that need it aren't going to visit the plants that the common species do. They have a special set of needs that we need to consider. The other thing is that these species are active at different times. There are some species, like this bee species down here, that's of conservation concern, is finished its entire cycle before June 1st. So if we're planting our bee plants that bloom in July and August, putting in our goldenrods, this bee species is out of luck, right? We need to think, okay, it's active in the spring. We need to put in willow. We need to put in spring blooming plants, good sources of nectar and pollen for this species. Our bumblebees are active through the season, but they peak at different times, and therefore they need pollen to make more bees. So bees need pollen to make more bees. The nectar is their fuel. So when they start to switch over to produce reproductives, they need a lot of pollen at this time to be able to produce the queens and the males that will mate to keep that population persisting. The same with the butterflies, they're active at different times. So we need to consider, when are they active in our when we're trying to figure out how to help them. The other thing is, thinking about what do they need? Where do they need to nest? What host plants? A lot of this for butterflies, the host plants, fairly well known. The nectar plants and preferences. So you could be a generalist, meaning that you're not going to starve. You'll eat something, but you don't do well on some things, right? So you might see a non-native plant where there are bees feeding on the nectar, but they aren't doing nearly as well as they would if you had a native plant there for them to feed on. So what are these connections between, what are the connections between these species of conservation concern from the animal side and the plant side? How do those relationships work? So what I did 2015 is I went out and I started collecting data on interactions to figure out what exactly I'm asking the animals, and I'm asking the plants, what do you want? What do you need? And they're telling me, once I compile the data and analyze the data, they're telling me what they want. And again, that's the flowers, the host plants, and from the plant side, we're looking at who are the major pollinators of many of these plant species that are in decline. So that's, I started doing that. It was a daunting task. You can imagine I need to try to collect data from across the state over a short period of time before these species become locally extinct. And so to help me out, I started the Beecology Citizen Science Project. So phase one of the project was to get citizen scientists to help me collect data on bumblebee plant flower interactions. We've now expanded the app this year. We're going to release the new version of the app where we've brought in iNaturalist API to include butterflies. And so we use iNaturalist to ID the butterflies and also to ID the plants. And so we're expanding our app so we can collect more interaction data because of how well the phase one of this project went. The second and the third phase, these new goals that we've added in terms of teaching ecologists how to assess habitat, and then how to collect data and what they need to do to restore areas. I'll talk a bit about those goals later in the talk. So for now, we're still trying to figure out what they need. And so here are some data that I collected from one site in July, short, medium, and this should say long-tongue bees, bumblebees. The ones that are of conservation concern are circled, and we can see there's a very clear distinction. The long-tongue bees like tubular flowers, and this isn't a surprise. I don't know why people haven't considered it in the past, but it makes perfect sense that you're going to match up, the tongue length is going to match up to the flower. Our short-tongue bees are all over milkweed. They like Joe Pyeweed. Our long-tongue bees are on red clover and vetch. You'll notice that this is non-native dominant. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But within these categories, we're seeing major differences. So Bombus vagans has a strong preference for prunella. By the way, all of these bees are located in the same place at the same time, and all these plant species are in the same place. So they have access to everything, yet we don't see them visiting everything at the same level, right? They're very clear preferences. And when I look across sites across the state, so I had 6 sites, I see the same pattern time after time after time. And this is how I learn what exactly they need to persist. That's nectar plants. When we look at what they need for pollen, remember pollen is how they make new bees. This was a bit of a shock. All of them were observed actively collecting pollen on the same few plant species, meadowsweet being one. So they do separate out to some degree when it comes to nectar, but with pollen, they're all competing for the same resource. So if you have a limited resource and a lot of competition, you're going to have winners and losers. And it turns out that the species that are less abundant and maybe not as good at collecting pollen as efficiently as some of these other species are losing out, and that certainly could contribute to their decline. Looking at the Beecology data, so I was able to notice patterns based on my primary research. The Beecology data showed the same thing. So here's Bombus terricola. I said it was all over milkweed. And here we're seeing, based on citizen science data from across the state, that they're preferring common milkweed. So what the Beecology data does is it helps to confirm the patterns that I'm seeing, and also helps me to look for new relationships and also areas where these species are located, and also where these plant species that they prefer are located, so I can collect more data in a more rigorous way. So the Beecology Project's been a tremendous success and a tremendous help, and has really moved conservation efforts forward. And so it's not just about the bumblebees. As I mentioned, we started, we're now moving into butterflies. I have a grad student looking at butterflies. So here are all the butterfly species that are in decline based on the primary literature. So this is mass butterfly data and a publication. Here's the percent change. Here's when they're active. Here's where they're located. And what we've noticed after 1 year of data collection is that we're seeing overlap. So Monarda is supporting 14 native butterfly species, 5 of which are of conservation concern. Remember, Monarda is a major plant for our bumblebee species of conservation concern as well. Prunella vulgaris is another one, 6 natives and 3 species of conservation concern. And we didn't really have large populations of Prunella. So there seems to be a strong preference for these 2 species. Looking at non-bombus bee species, there are a lot of those. Again, looking at the primary literature, we've identified those that are in decline. Whether they're generalists, only 2 of them I would consider specialists. Listed here, the rest are generalists, and here's when they're active. Some are done at the end of May, some of them don't come out until August, September. And so when we think about how we have to transform habitats, we need to consider these things. So all of this information I've compiled into my plant list, right? This plant list, based on my own observations, there are at this point close to 20,000 observations of bee flower interactions that went into this plant. As I mentioned, I collected data on butterflies and other bees. As we collect more data, this list will become more fine-tuned. I have the host plants for all of these butterflies, and all of this information is available on a lab website, gegearlab.weebly.com, or just send me an email. I'd be very happy to send you this list. I just updated the list, so there's a few new species for 2022. And so I haven't posted that one yet, so I will do so in the next couple of weeks. If you want that ahead of time, just send me an email. So now let's go from data to conservation action, right? So we've got these plants, I have all these relationships, so what? Does it actually do anything? And so I was able, the last 2 years ago, one of the good things that came out of COVID is people had a lot of time on their hand and they were able to establish these habitats. And so I'm working with them to develop plant lists, put the plants in, and so assessing the habitat. I follow the same steps. It doesn't matter if it's a backyard garden or if it's 100-acre conservation land. It's the same process. Go in and assess who's there. What are the native plants, the flower visitors? Are the target species there, the species of conservation concern? Are they lacking? I then take all those data and I make recommendations. Give those to the landowners, and they implement the change. And then after those changes are made, and this is extremely important, is I go back and I reassess to see the effects, the effects of those changes. More importantly, my goal is to give the landowner and anybody associated with that land the tools to be able to do those assessments and see the change on their own. So I give a lot of workshops on how to ID these species, how to identify a pollinator and think about plant pollination, And so not only can these people, the volunteers and the people that are that I'm working with see the change, but they can be the change, right? Putting these plants in and see that they've made a difference. And I can tell you, I've done this in Southborough, and jumping ahead a little bit, I've been able to see change pretty much instantaneously. We put plants and plugs in 40 acres of land where we saw maybe 1 or 2 of these species over an entire season. I saw 5 or 6 in a single visit. And that's how dramatic this is. And it's not just Southborough, it's many locations where we're seeing these dramatic changes. And the volunteers working and putting these plants in saw those bees show up as they were working. And because of that, they've led seed swaps. They're bringing these plants to their backyards. They know what to look for, and it's really motivated, and it's really moving things forward in a positive and a rapid way. So in terms of the habitat assessment, you might not need to add anything. You might just need to remove, in particular, non-native plants, invasives, purple loosestrife. You don't have to remove everything. If you remove just a fraction, it can have a major positive impact. So here, this is 40 acres in Southborough, Breakneck Hill. There's a wet meadow down here that had a lot of purple loosestrife, filled with thousands and thousands of honeybees and Bombus impatiens, which is a common species, none of the species of conservation concern. Again, there's a big difference between abundance and diversity. Abundance is important in agriculture. Honeybees are important in agriculture, but they have no business in conservation. And just because you see a lot of bees does not mean that you have a healthy habitat or you're helping. You have to make sure that you have the targets, because you can be fooled, and a lot of people are. And so what we did was remove the loosestrife, and so we removed the loosestrife, and all of these native plants grew up. The loosestrife was suppressing all of this native plant diversity. Mimulus, a huge population of mimulus. The first year I surveyed it, who did I see? That's in the video. Bombus vagans and Bombus fervidus, both of these species that I, again, don't see, maybe I see a handful over a year. They were on the same plant when these plants were allowed to bloom, the mimulus plants. Different milkweeds, there was swamp rose, and just filled with activities and activity by these and the butterfly species of conservation concern. So you may not need to plant anything. The other thing in terms of habitat assessment is you want to really minimize non-native pressure, in particular honeybees. There are no native plants pollinated by honeybees. They are competitors, and they are not helping when it comes to conservation. They play a tremendously important role in agriculture, don't get me wrong, but they should be performing their role on agricultural landscapes, but not moving into conservation land. Why? Because nectar and pollen are limited resources, and we have carpenter bees that are nectar robbers. So we have our hummingbird pollinated or long-tongued bee pollinated monarda that is made into a short tube flower by our carpenter bee that's biting a hole at the base of the flower. This opens it up for honeybees that have very short tongues. And so the last week of July, on monarda rubra, I saw a lot of vagans and fervidus, no honeybees, and none of the common bumblebee species. As soon as there were enough holes in the system, a few honeybees came in, and the following week, it was a whole different scenario, right? In a single, I saw over 100 honeybees on these plants, and I didn't see any of the target species. They got pushed out of the system by the presence of honeybees in just 1 week. Putting it in perspective, common bumblebees on mountain mint, there are no species at risk, but common bumblebees, it's a 10-to-1 ratio of honeybee to bumblebee for the common species, the same on milkweed, the same on goldenrod. So again, there's a big difference between abundance and diversity and bees in general and the target species, and we really need to pay attention to those differences. So what will we put in? Here is a suggested planting list. We start our nectar sources in the spring. Wood betony is a great source, all the way through to jewelweed at the end of the season. Having combinations of the penstemons and monardas has a major positive impact. Pollen sources, again, we've got to start early. We need willow, male willow, that have both nectar and pollen that would move into the native roses, into purple flowering raspberry and meadowsweet. So it doesn't take a lot of plant species to restore these systems. And it isn't necessarily, planting native is always a good thing, but if your goal is conservation, you have to target certain plant species that are of high conservation value, right? Like the Monarda is targeting our at-risk bees, our at-risk butterflies. And so just if you had to choose one, you would choose Monarda because it's the one that has the highest conservation value. And I'm in the process of giving each of our native plants a conservation value. In addition, if the plant like our penstemon is also in decline, it has high conservation value that's supporting these butterfly and bee species that also have high conservation value. I'll just quickly move through when we're restoring habitat. You know, I get this question all the time, so I threw it in, and that is cultivars, nativars. They are not the same as the real thing. So you always have to focus on the straight species. Why? Because these cultivars, we have bred them to do certain things that benefit us. We're not benefiting the animals that they co-evolved with. In fact, we're moving these plants away from what those animals prefer in many cases. And so even though they may look good to us, they might not look good to the animals. We really have to view things through the eyes of the animals that are in trouble and in need. And what happens is that when we breed for color, we breed for the size of the display, the plant has limited resources and it has to pull resources from one place to put into making the flowers bigger, you know, or whatever the trait is that we're selecting for. And the first thing to go when pulling these resources is nectar. Also, a lot of these traits are linked. And so when you start messing around with floral traits, you're going to mess around with nectar traits, whether you want to or not. So this is some data from Annie White. Some of you may have seen her talk recently for the group in Rhode Island, I think Rhode Island Wildflower Society. Anyway, here is the straight species in purple. And all the other species are cultivars. And if we just look at bumblebees, we can see here's how many are visiting the straight species, and the cultivars, it's reduced. So why is it reduced? As I mentioned, it could be because it's producing less nectar. In the case of this hybrid cultivar of Lobelia cardinalis, looking at hummingbirds and how much nectar it puts out, we can see that the straight species is putting out a lot more nectar than the non-native, and the animals are looking for nectar. If there's no nectar, they're gonna avoid the plant altogether. The other thing is that we're going to mess up the chemistry. And so just changing the volatiles in the nectar is enough to deter certain pollinators, right? We change the leaf chemistry, we're going to change what butterflies think of it in terms of the quality of a host plant. They'll start to avoid it. So it's much better to plant straight species, and all of the straight species on my list are available somewhere. I've been able to find pretty much all of them. And so, you know, I can let you know where I find them, or just send me an email. So the Beecology, so I mentioned I've established these habitats. I have one of my main sites is in Dartmouth, right next to the campus. So here's what it would look like before: a lot of non-native plants, ornamentals, you know, a few invasives in here, and this is what it looks like after, right? So it's a research and education center. I give a lot of talks here, and all the plants you see are plants from my list. And again, I put in plants and plugs, and they bloom the first year, and we see the species of conservation concern using the plants, and I use that as a point for education. Here's my site in Southborough, 40 acres. Here is the size of my habitat that's made a difference. So you don't need to change 40 acres to make a difference. You just need to put in the right things. Small amounts of the right things are enough to change things in a positive way. And so here's just some examples. All of these are pictures of the target bumblebee species. I have pictures of butterflies as well that my grad student has. She just hasn't processed them all yet. But they're all using plants in my habitats in the first year, except for showy goldenrod. It took a year for the showy goldenrod to bloom, but here it is in year 2 with the penstemon bloomed year 2. The showy goldenrod was year 1. But anyway, just some examples of the bees that are present on site that weren't there before. Or if they were there, the numbers were really low. And as I mentioned, it's not just about the animals, right? The pollinators, it's about their functional role. And what we're seeing, which is really exciting, is that on many of the sites, the plants we put in this case, the shrubby St. John's wort, which is a good pollen source for our bumblebee species and other bee species of conservation concern. Here it is, when it goes to seed, we have a white-throated sparrow feeding on the seeds and using the plant material as cover. White-throated sparrows are of conservation concern in the state. And so here we have the connection. that I'm looking for. And we're going to start to collect more data on how these habitats are changing wildlife, right? Who's using them, who's feeding on them, what's their conservation status, so that we can really restore those connections. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and thank everybody shown here. And there's some that should be on here that aren't, so I apologize if you feel you should be on here. And I'm happy to take any questions. Here, I can keep the share if you want, just with my contact information. You think that?
Well, thank you, Robert. That was a wonderful talk. And we just got a comment from our science director that she was really excited to hear what you had to say. And it makes me want to invite you right over to our pollinator garden and get your help and input to make sure that we're doing the right thing there. But I know there's other folks who would be interested in having you do some assessment, I would imagine, on their own properties. And is there anybody out there who's here tonight that would like to ask any questions along that line? We also had what vendors would you recommend? And perhaps this is something that you could. How did you get muted again?
I don't know.
Gosh.
Deborah, I have a question, Deborah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I presume this also applies to woodlands and woodland plants.
Yep.
And would we be able to get an idea of the plants that might be helpful in that respect?
Right. So good question. I think our understanding of what's going on in woodlands when it comes to pollination systems is, there's a recent publication looking at the bees in these systems. So they were not looking, and they typically don't look at interactions, but there are a lot of bees in woodlands that are restricted to woodlands, and we don't know much about them at all. So certainly collecting data similar to what I've collected in more open habitats would be valuable. But tree diversity, most of the nectar and pollen that they're using early in the season is coming from trees and shrubs. Mm-hmm. And so they clearly play a very important role, but we don't fully understand the role or what we would need to do to assess or restore woodland habitats. Right. But I certainly have some plants like wood mint is a really important one that grows in full shade that would be a part of woodlands, and in transitions there's certainly some shrubs in those transitions that would be from woodland to open that I do know about. So
great. So Robert, it would be super helpful if you wanted to send us a list of vendors and recommended places to go for finding the kind of species that you would recommend. And we'll go ahead and post that at the end of our recap of this video.
Yeah, I'll say that there's the Blue Stem Nursery is a new one out of Norwell that just opened last year, and they're really focusing on plants on my list. And so they're going to make those available. Northeast Pollinator Plants is another one that has a good number. I am establishing, part of what I'm doing with these habitats is getting the plants in and then using them as seed sources.
Right.
And then, and that's been very successful over the past couple of years. We've been able to collect seed and pass them on, do these winter sow events and get them germinated, and then getting them ready to put into the ground or have them for a plant swap or something.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Really appreciate your time. And I think we've learned an awful lot. So we will post this on our website as soon as we get it edited down. And you can see that Robert's email is there at rgegear@umass.edu. So I think umassd.edu. You can also reach out to him with your questions directly.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and have a great night.
Thank you. We've got one more question. I'm trying to unmute Steve. Oh, Lordy. Steve, are you there? Okay, there we go.
So Dr. Gegear, that one of the things that I found very interesting was when you were talking about cultivars not being as effective as the sort of the original, or the how would you describe that, the original species?
The straight species.
Straight species. So it seems to me that when you go to a nursery, or you go to buy seeds, that the vast majority of these seem to be cultivars.
Right. That's a problem. In fact, Native Plant Trust that you mentioned, we were chatting earlier, has a lot of cultivars, and I don't know why they do, because they do not perform their function.
Yeah.
But some do perform some function, but as you were saying, the energy from the plant that goes into creating the change that that is being bred into that particular plant might take resources away from other aspects of the plant that are beneficial for conservation.
Right. Well, when you're considering a plant and its function, a native plant has many functions. And so if we see that bee visitation hasn't been affected and assume that that plant is functioning, it's not
necessarily true.
No, and in fact, there are more examples of cultivars not performing. Just looking at nectar, I've been burned by cultivars. I've been doing this for a while, and people telling me they're straight species and they're cultivars, and I measure the nectar and there's no nectar, or the pollen qualities is no good, or there are just so many ways that it could go wrong that you should focus on straight species. And a lot of landscapers will say, oh, we can't find them. Well, that's just not true. Now that I know the nursery industry and I know what's available, that's not true. And so this idea that they're okay sometimes is just, if you are truly concerned about conservation and that is your goal, you do not use the cultivars unless you've studied them from all of these different angles, and nobody has done that yet. Right. So we can't assume. That's the problem.
I think that's a really good point. I know when we were looking for some of the plants in our garden, that people wanted to offer us varieties of columbine, for example, of which they had many different ones, and we had to turn them down and just say, no, sorry, we can only use this one native species, which are the little red and yellows that you see in the forest growing.
Exactly. Yep.
And so, sometimes when people are offering their generosity, it's not necessarily that you reject the generosity, it's just that you can't accept that particular offer. So thank you for pointing that out. And
I want to say too that, again, if your goal is to have some native plants that you find aesthetically appealing, I don't have a problem with that, right? If you want to just have a bunch of things buzzing around in your backyard, you could plant anything with nectar and you'll reach that goal, and I don't have a problem with that. But if you are using the term conservation and you're helping and you're using the term pollinator, there are very specific things that you need to consider that most people don't. And that is actually accelerating declines, because you're helping out species that already have an advantage. Anyway, sorry.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Well, wow. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really a great, enlightening, and hopefully we can call on your help in the future, and you can call on us to help you as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to give a workshop to again, it's all about being able to ID these species, to know that when you see a lot of bees buzzing around, that they're the right ones. And I have an ID sheet, and we have our app, which will help you with the ID process, and it goes to me and I can correct it. And so a lot of this is just education and being able to look at things at the species level. And it doesn't take much to be able to ID these things, and it really will go a long way in terms of conservation. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Bravo.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting.
Okay. You're very welcome.
Okay, great.
We'll be in touch.
Take care. Good night. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye. No other questions? All right. From Deborah.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening.